So, Joe, you have been crushing it with your newsletter lately. I'm digging the weekly impulse.
You like that? It's kind of fun.
It is, but you have some explaining to do.
Uh-oh. I think I know where this is going. I know where this is going.
So, what is going on with the 10% happier experiment?
I have been daily meditating for about 2 weeks now.
This, if you're new to Bookworm, that doesn't seem like that big a deal. If you've been listening for a while, you understand how much of a bombshell that is.
Well, okay. So the full story is I had an appointment with my Lyme specialist. Longtime listeners, Joe fights Lyme disease. But in the midst of that appointment, she made a comment that just kind of got me thinking about meditation, because she's been trying to get me to do something in this realm of mindfulness for quite some time. And this will actually tie into our book for today later on too. I was kind of dumbfounded how it all connected. But she got me to think about meditation in a way that I hadn't really thought about, because she basically showed me that I've been reaping the benefits of meditation, even though I don't do it regularly. I have a tendency to try it, leave it, try it, leave it, try it, leave it. And she was showing this, like, well, the fact that you keep coming back to it shows me that the meditation is teaching you to keep coming back to where you should be. Like, oh, come on. So you're telling me that whenever I think meditation is doing absolutely nothing, it's actually working quite well. So she pointed me in the right direction. I decided that if I were to make an actual commitment to meditating on a daily basis via financial commitment by actually paying for a service, I will dedicate time to it every single day and focus on it. Thus, Joe is now meditating every day, and I'm trying to notice where meditation has a positive impact on me outside of just focus. Like that's kind of where I've pointed my eyes in the past, and she's kind of helped me, broaden that perspective quite a bit. So 10% happier, it's where I spend time each day now.
Nice. And for people who want more information, you also have a newsletter about this. I'm not sure if they can go back and read the old episodes.
No,
it's not a
you actually
podcast. It's a
can't.
newsletter.
It's a newsletter.
Additions. But yeah, people should definitely go sign up for that, because I've been getting them because I was subscribed, I think, to your old newsletter.
Right.
But they are very well written. It's one of the few newsletters that I look forward to receiving every week. So well done, sir.
Aw, thanks, sir. No, they're fun. I spend a lot of time on them each week, so it's a good time. And you'll like the one coming out this week too.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
It's totally your fault.
Excellent.
Oh, fun times. That said, follow up. One of them on my list here is to apply the 80-20 rule to my work and where I spend my time. One of which was the newsletter and my blogging and where do I dedicate my time. And those are definitely sticking around for a while. So, because they definitely play into that 80 side of the 80-20. So I am focusing on that. So kudos to you for promoting it, because I'm gonna keep it.
Awesome.
So that's a piece that will stick around. There's a few aspects that are minor behind the scene that I'm gonna cut out of what I do each day. I'm not gonna talk about them because some of it's a bit sensitive. But it has been working really well. I have some lists on my side of things, but it's been a fun experience. So I don't know what else to say about it. So there you go. 80-20 rule, apply it to your work. It works really well. The other one is to test a potential business idea. I actually ended up testing two, Mike.
Okay.
One of which I'm going to come back to because I will talk about it this time. And it's mostly because it's going to be part of the newsletter, but this episode will release after the newsletter comes out.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone who's on the newsletter, if you get my newsletter and you're listening to this, you already know about this. so you already have a teaser for what I'm going to talk about later. But the other business idea that I tested completely fell on its face. So I'm glad I did not dedicate time to that one. Basically, it was a community of sorts that I wanted to build out and opted to not because almost nobody was interested in it.
Mm,
Thus, I saved myself a whole bunch of time.
nice.
There you go. So I tested two. One, I'm going to move forward with. The other, goodbye.
All right. I've got a couple here. One was to look into a VA, but when I said this, I said I was not going to do this immediately. So I did not do anything with this. Although we did get some feedback in the club from Tulip Girl, who encouraged me maybe not to delegate my planning of a Disney vacation to a VA, which was an interesting idea. I never thought of it from that perspective before, but she's basically saying that part of what makes something like a Disney vacation so fun is the anticipation. And I agree with that. I tend to just obsess over all the little details that don't really matter. Like,
you would never do such a thing, would you, Mike?
when I book flights, it's usually like a 7-day process, starting with Southwest and then looking on Expedia and then looking at every individual airline site and then going back to Southwest and then repeating like 3 or 4 times. It's insane the amount of hours that I spend looking for an ideal flight, because there really aren't any ideal flights from close to where I am. From Minneapolis, you can kind of direct flight anywhere, but even Milwaukee, you're going to have connections. And so, like, as we're recording this, next week I'm going out to San Francisco for the Relay 5-year anniversary show. I'm going to be a part of it, which is pretty cool.
Party time.
Yeah. That was ridiculously hard because I didn't want to get into San Francisco at 11 o'clock, which is like 1 in the morning my time. I also didn't want to leave at 5 in the morning my time. So yeah, just an example of how I tend to make things more difficult than they need to be, and where a VA could really help me with some of that probably.
Sure.
So I don't know exactly where I land on like the Disney vacation type stuff. I do think, though, that there are a lot of things like booking a flight for something that I do want to do. That's totally something I could have somebody else do. Hotels, too. I mean, hotels in San Francisco, you're not going to find a good deal. And you got to be careful where you get them. So I'm trying to find like a decent hotel. My wife's going to be with me. It's close to the venue. And I've never been to San Francisco before. This is paralyzing to me. There are literally thousands of hotels in San Francisco. But finally, we made a decision. I don't have to deal with that, at least till next time. Hopefully by next time I'll have a VA to do that.
But I think, like, coming back to the comment that Tulip Girl had made, like, some of the anticipation side of it was that in the process of doing the research and trying to figure out the details of how that trip should go, you learn more about the venue and the event that you're going to participate in. And that's what helps you build that anticipation. I think something like what you're talking about, I just need a hotel somewhere close. I just need a flight that gets me there within these parameters. Like, doing the research on that isn't really building anticipation as much as it is frustration.
Yeah, true. I mean, this was kind of like a anniversary birthday part 2. Part 1 was Max Stock. So it is kind of like a reward, fun trip sort of a thing. So, you know, I don't want to stay at the hotel that we're staying at is like a Marriott downtown. It's fairly decent, not a 5-star hotel or anything, but it's a nicer hotel. I probably wouldn't have picked that if Rachel hadn't been going with me. But I don't know. I could have said, go find me a nice hotel in San Francisco instead of obsessing over all of the options.
Sure.
And then, okay, so to wrap up this rabbit trail, all of those deal sites, they give you like the 40% off or whatever. And they change based on the time that you are looking at them. So as I'm doing all of this unnecessary research, I'm seeing the prices change. Some are getting more expensive, some are getting cheaper. And so like as soon as I make a decision about, this one seems like a good one, all of a sudden it's more expensive. And then something else is like got a flash deal going on. So that obviously reinforces the fact that, hey, don't hit the big red button yet.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's just the first one. The second one, use how can I help you instead of how are you. I mentioned I was going to do this sparingly. I haven't done this at all. It feels kind of sleazy, especially as I started reading this book. Um, yeah, more to come on that. But
Yep, I get it.
I do think I will still deploy this tactically. My last one was start learning a second language. I really didn't do a whole lot with this, but I did download Duolingo and I did go through a couple of lessons. And I do think that's the thing that's going to work for me. I still have trouble speaking Spanish. That's the language I'm going to start working on. But so far, I haven't had to roll my R's, so I'm good.
All right. Well, probably in the next time we record, or maybe the following time, I will ask you to roll an R on air.
Oh boy, not going to happen.
All right. So we'll have to keep up in the club. So we've mentioned this a couple times. Tulip Girl had mentioned some things on the Bookworm Club, and I just want to make a quick call out. Like, that's where we spend most of our time when we're interacting with listeners of the show. Like, that's where we do it. So club.bookworm.fm. If you're not a member there, join us. You can have conversations about the books and our action items. It's kind of a fun little place to chat.
Yep. Hey, I got to real quickly call out another piece of feedback that we got regarding the club. So
Okay.
Let me find this. It was posted by T Bombadil, which is an awesome username.
I like that.
Yeah. I'm not sure if the person's actually named Tom, but that would be amazing. They mentioned that on episode 68 and then episode 70, they listened to those episodes basically back to back.
Okay.
And they found it interesting that the Smart Notes book landed at 2.5, 3.5, while Michael Hyatt's book, Free to Focus, landed at 4.5 and 4.0, respectively. And basically challenged us and said, Free to Focus is kind of fluffy, and How to Take Smart Notes, even though it's not written very well, there's a lot more meat there. And I think that there's some truth to that statement. I wanted to call this out because I went back and I looked at the scores and basically was like, well, did I rate this wrong, or what influenced the rating that I gave it? And actually, my scores were pretty similar. Mine was the 3.5 and the 4.0. You were the 2.5 and the 4.5.
So I'm the wild, crazy one.
You're the wild card here. But I do also think that maybe what attributed to this, at least for me, was the readability of the book. You know, we're rating this in terms of recommending this to other people. That's part of what goes into the equation, at least for me. But also, kind of the point here was, it seemed like the How to Take Smart Notes really had a lasting impact, while there was nothing new in Free to Focus. And while I would agree with the not a whole lot new in the Free to Focus part, I also wanted to check in on the How to Take Smart Notes, because I know at the time we were all like, oh, we got to build our Zettelkastens. I pretty much have chucked that out the window. I'm still using drafts to capture ideas. I'm using Ulysses to flesh them out, but this is totally not a Zettelkasten. It's serving the same purpose for me, where I collect ideas and then I've got a place where I can develop them and publish them. But I just wanted to kind of push back, I guess, on the impression that we left after episode 68, where it's like, oh my gosh, this is transformational. Turns out really hasn't been super transformational for me. And I don't know about you. Maybe you want to weigh in on this. Maybe you don't, But I wanted to just chime in on that.
No, that's fine. I don't do the Zettelkasten at all anymore. Like, it's a really cool idea. And I think if you are someone who wants to write a ton of nonfiction or exploratory, do a lot of that type of work, I think it would make sense. But it's kind of a fun little side thing here and there. But I don't take or have the time to dedicate to doing something like that daily. For a while I did, but it's kind of fallen off. Like, it just doesn't stick. It's a cool concept, but it kind of stays there.
It is a cool concept. And I guess, if I were to analyze the way I've implemented it, I've kind of 80-20'd it for my needs, where I'm not doing the Zettelkasten, but I'm getting, in my opinion, the benefit of the Zettelkasten, where I can see how things connect and I never run out of stuff to write. That was really my goal when I went through it. Is like, I just want to be able to sit down and know exactly what I'm going to write. And that has been the case. And I've also been pushed lately in that area where I do need to crank out more words and write more articles. And it's going really well. So looking back on it, I still think that there was value for me in reading that book, and I'm happy with the results that I've gotten from it. But also, I want to call out that, we get excited in a particular episode about something we're going to try. It doesn't mean that it's going to stick forever, and that's okay. Number one, it's okay if it just completely disappears. But number two, the real value in all of this stuff is figuring out how it works for you and then applying it that way, not sticking to the system that they describe. So,
Right.
We talk about that a lot, but I wanted, because we just got this piece of feedback and it was really well written feedback, and I was glad to see it come through in the Bookworm Club. I wanted to call it out, and then also just reiterate the idea that you really don't know how this stuff is going to play out and impact you, which is why you just keep collecting new dots and trying new things and figuring out long term, what's really going to stick.
Thus, Bookworm. Woohoo!
Thus,
Go
Bookworm, and thus today's book, which is The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life by David Brooks. Right on the heels of Tim Ferriss and the 4-Hour Workweek. Couldn't have planned that better.
This is such a different book than what we went through last time.
Such a different book. So, Tim Ferriss and the 4-Hour Workweek. And by the way, I want to call out, because I'll just say it that way. I was a little harsh going through that. I didn't think I went completely off the rails like I thought maybe I would when we recorded it. But I definitely got some feedback from people saying that Tim Ferriss is really had a positive impact in my life. And I think that's awesome. I think that is probably Tim Ferriss's goal, and everybody else that we read, like at some level, that is their goals. They want to make a difference, and that is completely fine. Tony Robbins, another guy that not my cup of tea, but does a ton of good. I think when he wrote the Money book, he mentioned that like he gave away 40,000 Thanksgiving meals or something like that. I got the number wrong, I know, but it was a ridiculous number, and it really stood out to me when I started listening to that book on Audible, because it was so long. I was like, man, that's really cool, And he tells a story about how when he was a kid, somebody dropped off a Thanksgiving meal for his family when they couldn't afford one, and so that really stuck with him, and he's still paying it forward. I think that's awesome. So nothing against Tim Ferriss, the person, but I didn't really, obviously, enjoy the 4-Hour Workweek, and you can go back and listen to that episode for all my thoughts on that. The big takeaway, if I were to encapsulate it, was that I felt it was a little bit self-serving. I use the term selfish, egocentric, whatever. David Brooks is on the complete opposite end of that.
Yes.
This whole idea in The Second Mountain is that people tend to take the Tim Ferriss approach and seek individual success, purpose, meaning, whatever. They climb that first mountain, they achieve their goals, they get to the summit, they look around and they're like, is this it? And then they see a second mountain and then they're like, oh, that's the one I should have been climbing the entire time. Is that a fair synopsis?
Yes, but the trick there is that you also have potentially a valley between those two mountains.
Yes, exactly.
And we'll definitely have to cover that. We've got a few points here to go over that, but that first mountain is all about achieving success, and define success however you like. It doesn't matter. So once you reach that peak, that's when, to your point, you realize, well, okay, is that the point? No. And then you go through this valley. Not everyone does. He does call that out. It's like not everyone's journey is the same. Some people start in the valley, climb the first, and then just keep going on to the second. Some people do skip the first mountain and go straight to the second mountain. But that second mountain, I guess we'll get into some details about what it is, but it's basically what is the purpose behind your life and how do you go about achieving that?
And it's always bigger than yourself.
Exactly.
It's always based on what good you can do for other people, which is where Tim Ferriss's book left off, which makes sense. He wrote it a while back. If you were to interview Tim Ferriss today, probably has a totally different mindset. Somebody also had mentioned, when he wrote that book, he had basically just been jilted by a girl that he thought he was going to marry. And then I totally can see where that would throw you for a loop, and then you got to figure something out, and where do I go from here, sort of a thing. But again, we'll leave that in the past for now. Let's dive into the book itself. It's broken down into really two different sections, although there's 5 parts here. The first part is the 2 mountains, and then the second part talks about the 4 different areas, basically, that you would climb your second mountain. But those are broken down into their own individual parts. So thus we've got 5 different parts here. in the outline. Let's dive into part one, which is the two mountains here. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to find this first mountain using a term that he uses in this book, which is going to appear again and again, and that is hyper-individualism. And he talks about how this is not a new problem. He uses an example, which I thought was interesting, of the colonists when they came to North America, that the colonists occasionally would defect to native tribes, but the natives would seldom go the other way. The colonists thought that they had the superior civilization, but really he makes the point that people were voting with their feet the other way. They would train the natives, and then the natives would always go back because those native cultures were communal and they had these close attachments, and the colonials just couldn't figure that out. They thought they were superior. That's basically what hyper-individualism is. You think that your life is superior to the people around you, which when I read that, I'm like, yes, that is exactly the impression that I got from the Tim Ferriss book. You just described it way better than I did in an hour and a half. Thanks a lot, David Brooks. I feel like an idiot.
I do love that story, though, because there's another aspect of it where there were occasions when the natives would kidnap some of the colonists, and the colonists would then go about rescuing those who had been kidnapped. But whenever those who had been kidnapped were rescued, they would run, and they would run away, and oftentimes would find themselves back with the natives because they preferred that lifestyle once they had become familiar with it.
Yeah, really, really interesting, and just kind of shows that we tend to have a bias towards our own way of life. But I think there's a lot of value to consistently asking the question, is there a better way? Is there something out there that is at another level from what I currently know? We tend to stick with what we currently know because it's comfortable, but I don't know. The whole idea behind the second mountain is really appealing to me. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff that he talks about, these are questions that I've been asking for a while. David Brooks is just a much better writer than I am.
He's phenomenal.
He's a really good writer. We'll get into author's style when we get to the rating at the end, but this is a very, I won't say easy read because it is very meaty. Actually, when I was reading this, it reminded me a lot of a class I had in college where we had to read a C.S. Lewis book, and then we would have discussions on it, and we would have to write a one-page paper, which sounds super simple, except that we were basically forced with the constraint of a one-page paper to write a really, really good paper, get all of your thoughts out and articulate them well. And it was actually one of the most difficult papers that I've ever had to write. But it was taught by a professor who was probably friends with David Brooks. Just super, super smart. And really just challenged everything. It was very different. I remember thinking when I was in that class that a lot of the classes that I was in, the goal of the teacher would be just to get you to verbalize any random idea that you had. And if you threw something completely stupid out there, they would just reinforce it. Oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way. But this guy, like, he wouldn't discourage you from doing that, but he would always ask the follow-up questions, and you would always have to have some sort of thought process behind the idea. And whenever you could totally tell there are people in that class that, like, they had never been challenged like that before. What do you mean I have to defend my beliefs? Like, I've never had to do this before. Just the fact that I had this idea, that makes it valid, right? No, you got to put more thought into it. And so it was really interesting. He just thought on a whole different level, and he didn't do it in a way that was mean, but he would just ask questions. And he would provoke you to think deeper about things. You couldn't just settle for the surface level of opinions in that class. And that's what this book reminded me of, is like when we read that C.S. Lewis book, you had to read it over and over and over again to catch really what he was saying. And that's kind of the impression that I had with this book. And it's too long for me to have read it multiple times before we recorded it. I barely got through it. I finished it this morning, actually.
Yeah.
But it is so much meat here. And he also brings in a lot of stuff from other people which support his ideas. And a lot of books have been written on, like a one paragraph thing that he mentions. There's a lot here. And if you just skim over it, you're going to miss a lot of the depth that's in this book.
For sure. I do want to come back to this hyper-individualism concept because he does give the history of where this comes from. And I think that's kind of important to lay that foundation before we get into the rest of this, Mike.
Yep.
Because he goes into how from like the 1910s into like the 50s, I believe, where because of the world wars and a number of other factors, we had built a society and a culture that was communal and was driven by looking out for each other. We're all in this together, that mentality. And once we got past the Second World War, there was a bit of a start of a rebellion against that in the 50s and 60s and came into a head in roughly the 70s. But there was this rebellion against we're all in this together, and it came through in the form of I'm free to be myself. So we ended up creating a culture that focuses inward more so than outward. And he does go into quite a few results of that, one of which is what he calls the Instagram life or the aesthetic life, where we have a tendency to catch the high points. Like we've heard this before. We've talked about this on the show before, where people like to share the best moments of their life.
Yep.
And it makes us look amazing. You got the fancy car, you got the fancy house, you got this, you got that. You're doing this experience, you're going here, you're going there. But we only share those highlights as a way of showing off what we've accomplished. This is one of the sub points I wrote down, was centrality of accomplishment, because this is something I feel like we see a lot of, in that we put a lot of emphasis on, especially with students, how they are driven towards succeeding in sports or academics, in school, you name it. Even when we get into adulthood and in a career or a job, like it's something where we put a lot of emphasis on how well we achieve something. I even see this today in my own life. Like I find myself kind of working towards achievements that would make it look as if I'm successful. And I always want to paint things in that way. And I don't want to do that. Like that's not my intent, but that's what everyone around me does. Like everybody I run into is in that same mindset. And it all comes from this hyper-individualism mentality, which in our society is driven by this individual accomplishment goal.
Yep, totally. If I had not pretty much completely given up Instagram already, this chapter would have been enough for that to be an action item for me.
There you go.
Yeah. So I guess to borrow all of the productivity terms, let's open up the kimono, take you backstage, reveal the deep, dark secrets here. Mike is the insecure overachiever described in chapter 3. Actually, I should say, when I read that, I felt like this was me. In fact, that was the note I put in my mind note file, is I think this was me, exclamation point. I feel like I'm on the road to recovery. Focused has helped a lot with that. Bookworm has helped a lot with that, where it's kind of just challenging the norms that are out there, what people see, because nobody really has all this stuff figured out. Nobody has it all together. And I think that there is a lot of value, and I hope that, I'm guessing, but I believe that listeners of Bookworm feel the same way, that it's refreshing to hear people who will share their honest struggles about things. Now, there's obviously a fine line there, because no one wants to hear you just complain about all the stuff that you're going through. But this whole idea of the insecure overachiever, this is focusing solely on what you were just talking about, the individual achievement. They call it the meritocracy in that chapter on the insecure overachiever, where the focus is on productivity, grit, self-discipline instead of love, service, and care. The community is a group of talented individuals competing with one another, and the soul-flattening influence is only survivable if you have your own competing moral system or values. When I read that, it kind of smacked me in the face. It made me feel a little bit, what's the term I'm looking for here? I want to be careful. I didn't feel great maybe about some of the stuff that I have done in the past. I recognize that, it is a journey, and part of the fact that you put out stuff that is wrong in your eyes later on, like that is part of the journey, and there's no way to escape that. The only alternative is not to do anything, and that's something that I dealt with for a long time. I've been delivered of that, I'll say, and I'm glad for that. But there is always in the back of your head, like, I don't want to put out something that's going to encourage somebody to do something the wrong way. I don't want to build the wrong beliefs.
Sure.
I want to help people in a positive way. And when you are climbing your second mountain, you look back at some of the stuff you did in the first one, you're like, what an idiot.
Yeah.
So I recognized myself in some of that. The aesthetic life, going back to your main point, I feel like this is completely on display in most of the productivity world. I'm glad to see not just focused bookworm, stuff like that I'm involved with, but things like Hurry Slowly, Jocelyn K. Glei, Make Time, which we covered, Jake Knapp, John Zaratsky, where they are explicitly saying this is not a productivity book, and it really is, I would argue, but it's taking a different approach to things. I feel like that's really healthy. I'm hoping that continues, and that this wave, I don't know what to call it. It's not exclusively relationalism like he's talking about at the end of this book, but just people challenging the idea of hyper-individualism, even if they don't know what hyper-individualism is. Like, I can see this as a trend that's happening, and I hope that it continues.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And I feel like you and I have been promoting that to some degree or another. In most every book we come across, it might be a theme that we find ourselves hunting for, simply because, we struggle with it in the productivity space, and in that world of self-improvement, it seems like it's easy to share and talk about the pinnacle of how things should operate. And, I can talk about how a journaling habit can help you be more reflective. And I can talk about all the tips and tricks on how to find the time and develop the time to work on that particular habit. Same thing with reading. We read tons of books. I had a conversation with a guy at Macstock, Tony. Hi, Tony. About the process of starting to read more books, and how when you and I started, we didn't read this many books. Like, this is not a case where
Right.
Mike and I were reading a book a week and we're like, hey, you know what? We do this all the time. Maybe we should just start recording these. Like, no, that's so far from the truth. Like, I think I read 3 books in the 2 previous years leading up to Bookworm.
Yeah, we did it because we wanted to change our default behavior to that of one who reads books.
Exactly. So with that in mind, we made the commitment to starting to build in this habit and make that commitment to reading books, because it was something that we wanted to develop in ourselves. So I just want to kind of quell that perception, because a lot of people I learned at Macstock got the perception that, we do this all the time. It's like, well, we do now. 3 years in, yes, we do this now, but
yeah,
not then, not back when we started.
That's interesting. I agree, and it raises the question in my head. We read Atomic Habits by James Clear, which was a phenomenal book on habits. And he talks in there about, if you want to become a writer, you show up and you write. Okay, so if you want to become a reader, you show up and you read. That's what we did. We said we want to become readers, so we're going to read more. At what point along the journey, though, do you think we transition from somebody who doesn't do this to somebody who does do this?
Oh gosh, I don't know. After 10 books? I don't know.
Six months in, we're 3 years in. It's kind of interesting because people join in now and they say, "Oh yeah, you read a book every week." But at what point did you feel okay saying, "Yeah, I read a book every week or every other week," without the gap books?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's hard to nail that down, but I think it has to be somewhere in the realm of when reading the books, like you don't have to work at making it happen.
Sure.
And reading 25, 30 pages a day is just kind of normal.
Yep.
Wherever that happens, that's probably that point. But is that a month in? Is that 18 months in? Where is that? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. You can't look back and say, this was the point where I became a reader.
Right.
Which is interesting to me because this is a journey. We talk about how we're on this same journey everybody else is. And really, you don't know when you've arrived. Although I would argue maybe you never actually arrive.
Or like here's another way of coming at it with this particular show is, when would you call yourself a bookworm?
Right.
Everyone who listens to this, like my tendency is to think that everyone who listens to this is a bookworm. So hello, fellow bookworms. But
I'm a bookworm when I have my library with the sliding ladder.
See, even you and I wouldn't. That's like the show is called Bookworm, but I struggle to call myself a bookworm at the same time.
Aspiring bookworms.
There you go. So welcome, fellow aspiring bookworms. There you go.
Yeah, well, that's a tangent that I really hadn't planned on going into, but I think it's really important. This whole idea of the aesthetic life, this just kind of smacked me in the face. And I think Instagram has always, not always, let me rephrase that. Instagram, if you hear people talk about social media, at least in the tech circles that we tend to pay attention to, you will hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, Twitter is a cesspool, Instagram's the good one, that's where I hang out." But when you describe Instagram as basically the tool for supporting the aesthetic life and hyper-individualism that is attached to it, it really kind of paints it in a negative light, which I think is more fair and more accurate, and I'm okay with. I thought it was interesting, an interesting observation as I was going through this.
And I will say that like that whole Instagram life, and like kudos to you for being honest about the insecure overachiever thing. It's not easy to just come out and say, but all of that revolves around, in the scheme of first mountain, valley, second mountain. Once you become aware of it, that's where you're in that valley. There's more to that, and there are other crises that can put you into that valley when a massive issue causes you to stop and reflect on the things that you do every day. And it makes you wonder, like, am I doing the thing I should be doing? Like, that's when you're in the valley, is when you're almost in a moment of despair or are in despair. I will say that, like, me personally, I feel like I'm slowly starting to come out of that valley to start climbing this second mountain.
Yeah, me
That's
too.
where I personally feel like I'm on this journey. But he tells story after story after story about folks who were in the valley, what their valley was, and how they came up out of it. And I compare, because I can't help myself, I compare their valley to mine, and I think, well, maybe I just had a little dip. Like, I don't know. Like, it doesn't seem that bad when I look at those.
Yeah. No, that's true. And the definition for being in the valley that he uses in the book is the telos crisis. It's defined by the fact that people in it typically don't know what their purpose is. When it happens, they become fragile. This is also where he uses that quote from, I don't know how to say this, Nietzsche?
Yeah.
He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. It's something that people have, at least in the productivity space, heard for a long time because it's attached to the idea of, just find your why. Not so simple. I developed a whole course on helping people do that, by the way. Which I still feel really good about that specific thing. I do think that focusing on that question, like, that's one of the things that is on my second mountain. But I also don't want to rehash the whole thing, but I did tell the story of how I got to where I am today and the things that I'm doing and how it kind of came as a shock to me. I'm not going to retell that, but looking back on it as I'm reading this whole section on the valley, I realized that that was kind of my valley, where I was working with a family business and then thought I found my thing, and then my thing was ripped out from under me, and then it's like, okay, what's my other thing?
Is there another? Please.
Yeah, is there another thing? Hopefully. But the whole idea of going through the valley that he talks about in here, there's nothing really intrinsically noble about the suffering, but going through stuff, I would argue, having read this, is a valuable experience. It does kind of shift your perspective. He says specifically that there are three things that suffering teaches us. It teaches us gratitude. It calls for a response. So when you are suffering, you want to do something to alleviate it. And then also it shatters the illusion of self-sufficiency. So that is very true. I can tell you that from personal experience. If you think you are all of that, and then all of a sudden your thing is gone, and all of a sudden it's not about you anymore, that will destroy your self-sufficiency. That will make you think, oh, maybe you're not as great as you thought you were. And to be honest, I never really tried to anyways portray that I had it all figured out. But, we're just talking about how that's kind of the general tone of the productivity space. And this book helps me realize really the big issue that I have with it, like why it bothers me so much when I see that now. And that's basically a part of it, is I think it just kind of glosses over maybe, the people who are spewing that stuff, they haven't gone through the valley yet. But it's dangerous, I think, because when you read that sort of thing, it kind of diminishes the fact that the valley is there. And I don't know, I guess, looking back on my experience, didn't see the valley coming. Maybe I thought, well, maybe some people have to go through the valley, but I don't have to. I'm just going to skip it because I know better. Nah, not what happened.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what this second mountain is before we jump into some of these other pieces, because we need to get into those. Cause
this is the big one, by the way. I mean,
yeah.
When I was reading through this, I'm like, half the show is going to be part one, half the show is going to be all the other parts combined.
Yep, for sure. So, the easy way I think to compare and contrast this is with the 4-hour work week. Perfect timing. That's why we were saying that earlier. The 4-hour work week is the path and journey of hitting the peak of the first mountain. That's kind of the way I saw it, Mike. Like that whole book was designed to help you get to the peak of the first mountain. But I think some of the issues that you and I took with it were that whole lifestyle is one that tends to be geared, at least the way Tim Ferriss put it, was geared around travel and such. Obviously, you can extract that from it. He does call that out. But I think that once you hit that peak and you start to ask the question, is this all there is? That's the point at which you can start to fall into that valley and wonder, well, what was it all worth? Now, to Tim Ferriss's credit, he does at the end say that whenever you're at these trips and you're doing all the new rich things, like you have to focus on helping other people as a part of that. It was kind of an afterthought, it felt like, but anyway,
yeah,
I need to stop talking about it.
I'm not going to give Tim Ferriss credit for that.
All right. So you hit this valley. We've talked about that. Me personally, I had hit a point when I was having a lot of success in corporate jobs and such, and then ended up in a scenario where I was doing a lot of web development and such, and a lot of that has come crashing down on me. A lot of that has to do with my own health that has just taken a nosedive and has forced me into this valley and made me stop and rethink a lot. This is one of the action items. I don't have any in the outline yet, but one of my action items is to, this afternoon, go have a conversation about a lot of this with my wife. Because there's a lot of these things that because of this book, I'm just now starting to be able to put words to. I've been feeling them, but I didn't really understand them well enough to relay them. So kind of getting some fresh thoughts here on Bookworm, but I'm going to be sharing some of this with my wife this afternoon as well, on a much deeper level and a more personal level, of course. But
Hot takes.
I know, right? What I'm trying to do is understand, what does this second mountain look like? Because the main thing he talks about is trying to determine where that second mountain, or which second mountain you're going to climb, because there's a few different areas you can do this in or need to do this in. And I'm trying to nail down exactly what that looks like for me, mostly from a vocation point, which we'll get to right here. And I have a process that I want to go through in order to understand what that is for myself. And I think I have at least the starting point for it. Thus, I'll explain it here in a little bit. But
Cool.
anything else you want to add to that before we move on?
Yeah. So the Tim Ferriss thing, the thing that really encapsulates the difference of perspectives here, I think the best, is in chapter 8, where we're talking about the second mountain. And David Brooks says that second mountain people know why they have been put on this earth. And like we talked about earlier, it's not individual gain. So there is a bigger purpose that involves other people, and you know exactly what that thing is. And that's the piece that I felt was missing from the Tim Ferriss book. That actually does not diminish the quality of the book itself. Like I mentioned, I wrote stuff, made stuff when I was ascending the first mountain, and I look back on it now and I'm like, man, young Mike Schmitz was a jerk.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm still a jerk. I don't know. I'm constantly trying to get better.
100%.
But
You're all jerk. Completely.
Well, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to assume that I've arrived. Like, this is peak Mike right here. Definitely not the case. But the whole idea of like second mountain people know why they've been put on this earth, that phrasing challenged me. I created faith-based productivity. I have that sheet that I created with my life theme on it. Like, that's a big part of what I've been thinking about and brewing on for the last, I don't know, say year or so. Maybe longer than that. But I feel like even what I have currently isn't like the final version of that. I think that is the thing that I can use to answer honestly if someone asks me, like, what is your purpose? You know, I will rattle off that life theme, and it's to help people answer the question, why am I here? By inspiring, encouraging, and teaching them to connect to their calling, discover their destiny, live the life they were created for. 100% believe that, but I also 100% believe that that's not going to be the thing 5, 10, 15 years from now. It's going to be a derivative of that. And I don't know what path that's going to take. One other thing here, which I think is an important difference between first mountain and second mountain, is the distinction between a commitment and a contract. So a contract, David Brooks defines as a transaction, whereas a commitment is a relationship. So right there, we're back to the idea being that productivity is really about other people. It's not about what you can accomplish, hyper-individualism. Contracts are based on the benefits, how they can benefit you. Commitment is about the transformation, and really, I would argue, the benefits that you can give the other person. Ed Cole is another author that I really respect, said it this way: love is the desire to benefit others at the expense of self, and lust is the desire to benefit self at the expense of others. And that's kind of the picture that I got here between a contract and a commitment. We'll get into the marriage stuff later, but the commitment being like, I'm in this for better or for worse. Contract would be, I'm in this until I don't want to be anymore.
No, I think that's a good way to look at it. There's 4 mountains here that he says that we need to climb. 4 second mountains, 4 different areas that you need to climb a second mountain within. Vocation, marriage, as Mike alluded to, philosophy and faith, and the 4th one is community. He lumps philosophy and faith together into one. Let's go into vocation first, because he does call out the difference between a career and a vocation. So career is a path of jobs that you're going to go through in order to achieve success in the first mountain. Vocation is where you're starting to tap into your inner desires and your inner ways of helping others. that's when you start to climb that second mountain. And yes, it might be called work, but it isn't for any other gain other than to help someone else or for your own, to fulfill your own passions, which need to be others focused. Is that a fair summary, Mike?
Yes, definitely. The whole idea in this section on vocation, because I feel like we've kind of talked about that quite a bit already in terms of your vocation is bigger, others focused. But there's an idea that's tied to this, which is the annunciation moment. Do you remember this concept?
Yes.
Okay.
This one.
So the definition of an annunciation moment is the moment where something sparks an interest or casts a spell and arouses a desire that somehow prefigured much of what comes after in life, both the delights and the challenges. Typically happens when you're young as something enthralls you. And I'm curious, do you have an annunciation moment?
I think there's two, actually. One that happened to me when I was little, and another that I think I might be in the middle of right now, which is kind of weird. When I was little, and when I say little, I think I was 9, I had like a week-long trip. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a camp. It wasn't like a church camp or anything. It was a week-long trip of some sort, and for the life of me, I've not been able to figure out what it was. But at the end of that trip, I told my mother that I felt like I needed to go into the ministry in some form. And I had no idea what that meant. I knew I did not want to be a pastor. I knew I didn't want to be going to seminary or anything, but I wanted to go into ministry somehow. And a lot of years later, I'm now working full-time at our church. And whenever I told my mom that I was accepting a full-time position at our church, she's like, "Oh yeah, I knew you would eventually do that." Like, thanks, Mom. Thanks. Love you. So that was kind of the first. I think I had a moment like that, and I'm only just now starting to. So maybe now's not the annunciation moment. It's more about like now I'm coming to the realization of what that is. But I also know that like the way that comes out in me, because I have such a strong background in the tech space, and we talk about this whole being intentional and mindfulness thing. It comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely fascinated by a lot of it. You call me Analog Joe all the time. Like it's a thing.
I do.
But I think that like the analog thing is always a fascination to me. Like people get on to me if I ever mention anything remotely about listening to an audiobook because I'm big on the paper books. I do a lot of things with physical objects in some degree versus the digital side. So I've been having conversations about this with my wife and a few other folks, and a few of you have emailed me about this over time. And then Mr. Mike Schmitz texted me, when was this, 3 weeks ago? 4 weeks ago? He looked up to find out, I have no idea what possessed you to do this, and I was kind of angry at you for doing it at first, but I'm coming around to it. But he hunted down and discovered that analogjoe.com was available. You can't just leave that sitting there. You have to acquire this. So I made the purchase for analogjoe.com and have been trying to figure out what that becomes. And in the like the last week, in having these conversations with a few folks, because I played around with what to do with that domain. Like, do I set it up and just have like a list of all the gear I use in the analog space? But that seems kind of weird to me. I debated making it its own business of sorts. And it has occurred to me that a lot of people are asking for a way to get together, not about analog productivity necessarily. Like that could definitely be a piece of it, but they're looking for a community of sorts that's just analog, period. Whether it's analog music, analog like cooking methods, there's like ways of interpreting analog coffee making versus like all the digital ways of doing it. Like
that might be the thing that gets me in there.
I know, right? Because you use the whole robot thing to do yours. so these conversations have come up with me quite a bit, and I think I'd like to do something about it, because this is something that I feel very strongly about, because I know that a lot of people struggle with being intentional, because all of these digital tools and digital devices and the screens everywhere, it gets to be a lot. And there's a large number of people that are looking for ways to get off of it. Now, it's a bit weird to think about building a digital community to help you get off of digital. I get that juxtaposition going on there, but it's something that I'm going to give a try. And oddly enough, my wife is interested in this. I finally found something that she's interested
Mrs.
in
Analog.
participating. I know, it's crazy. So she is considering how her role in this is going to play out. But right now, I have no idea what this actually means per se. But the goal is to take analogjoe.com and build a community that is geared towards stepping away from digital devices, and how do you engage the real world in this space of digital abundance that we live in. That's the concept, because I've had a very strong passion towards that. And I think that combining that in different avenues between what I do at the church and what I do on my own, like they're kind of coming into a conjunction where they're going to collide. Now, I'm still keeping some of them separate depending on how you come at them. But for me as a whole person, like they do have a tendency to overlap. But that's what I'm shooting towards. So I think this all started because of you, Mike. So thanks for that. But
Love it.
reading the
Send
second
the royalties
mountain,
to my house.
but reading the second mountain, like I don't know how many times I was reading through, especially this vocation section. I was like, yes, yes, yes. And I have all kinds of like these little one sentence phrases that I've written down in my notebook about how this could come to a realization in my own life. So thank you for picking this book and for sending me a domain. I did not want to buy it originally. So thank you, sir.
No problem. You know, a lot of the stuff that you were just describing gets into some of the stuff from chapter 12 with vampire problems, it's called.
Yes.
And
I love that
this
term.
whole chapter is weird. The story at the beginning is basically that you are faced with the choice of becoming a vampire or not, and you don't know what you're going to be like if you get bit by the bat, whatever. It makes it sound like it's your choice, but you don't know what the other side's going to look like. That's really the point that he's making. There's really nothing else about vampires in here, but I probably would have phrased it a little bit different, but I understand what he's saying, and there's a lot of value in this. He talks about when you're choosing a vocation, don't discount interest. He says that knowledge is plentiful, but motivation is scarce. So what you were talking about with the analog stuff, something that you're passionate about, there's a lot of people who maybe have written things about the benefits of analog tools. But really the thing that makes analogjoe.com work is the fact that you are passionate about it and you're willing to show up and build a community around it. And, we're talking about this now like it's already happened. Maybe. So I guess pressure's on you now, but
Yep. Well,
but
by the time this releases, you'll be able to go there and sign up. I'll put it that way.
Okay, cool. But I wanted to call that out because as much as I rail against the idea of passion and just doing what you love, there is something to be said for that. And I don't think it's actually too far off when you consider like the real definition of passion, which is something that you're willing to suffer to come see about. We've talked about that before. We don't have to go there again. But that's really what it comes down to is motivation is something that you are willing to push through the obstacles that are going to appear. When you are setting this thing up, it's not going to go, even if you set up 1,000 websites, you're going to encounter some point of friction along the way. And motivation is going to be the thing that allows you to push through and actually follow through with the thing. So that's a really powerful idea, and I like the way that he frames it here. What am I motivated to do? That's an important question to ask when you're trying to find out what your second mountain is all about. He also mentions that when you're in search of a vocation, say yes to everything. There's these moments of obligation, he calls them, and you never know where the next thing that you say yes to is going to lead. I think that's maybe a little bit different than a lot of the traditional advice that you would hear now, and even that I would give people, where the default needs to become no. I don't think these are ideas that are at odds with each other. This is really speaking to 18-year-old me, 22-year-old me. When you get out of college, try some things. Don't just automatically go into your career. Figure out some things. And I feel like I've kind of done that later than maybe I should have in life. I've talked about how I really enjoy public speaking, but that was never something that I anticipated I would enjoy doing. It took me recording some screencasts and then recording some podcasts and then being scared out of my skin to go to a Toastmasters meeting, but doing it anyways and realizing that, oh, hey, actually, I really enjoy this. Yes, it freaks me out, but I feel very fulfilled when I'm doing it. You know, just as an example of like the kind of path that you can't really predict. He says it this way: think of yourself as a fish hoping to get caught. And then when you feel those tugs, like the one I just described with public speaking, then you ask a couple follow-up questions. You know, is it big enough? Am I uniquely positioned to make this happen? And am I truly passionate about this thing? So I don't know. I thought that was really valuable advice for somebody who is maybe reconsidering their vocation. I want to go back to the enunciation moment idea here for a minute, because I put you on the spot and you shared yours.
Yeah.
But I also want to just real briefly share mine and then encourage everybody who's listening to this to kind of identify theirs. I won't tell the whole story because I have told it before, but really my journey into this productivity space started for me when I was I had gone through Bible college in our church because we had a satellite campus, and I got my Bible college degree. Basically, I say for funsies. You know, my goal was not to become a pastor, but I just wanted to learn more. And so they had a way for me to do that, and I was just eating it up, loved it. So got my Bible college degree, then they asked me to teach a class on personal management. And as I was going through and studying the syllabus on personal management, I was reading things like Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, and really just got this revelation of how seriously I believe God takes productivity and stewardship. And, you know, I was looking around and I saw the problem in front of me of like, man, people just don't get this. They sit and they wait for things to happen, but I believe God's waiting for you to do something so he can help you multiply the talent that he gave you, and it can't be multiplied if you don't take action, you know, all that sort of stuff that led to me writing my book, that led to me getting the job with Asian Deficiency, getting connected with everybody else that I do everything with. You know, I met you through AE. I met David Sparks, Sean Blanc, I believe, through there too. Like, as much as I look back on that time there and have mixed feelings about how things went down at the end, there's no doubt that that was part of my journey, and I can look at it and I could be grateful for the things that have come from it, the relationships essentially that have come from it. To David Brooks's point, this is all about relationships. It's not about the things. I don't look back and be like, man, I'm really glad that I built that course or I did this thing.
Right.
You know, it's
right,
like,
for sure.
I met these awesome people who I get to continue the conversation with. That's the valuable thing. And so, you know, just to wrap this up with the enunciation moment, I would challenge everybody to kind of think about what's yours. And maybe you have an enunciation moment, but you haven't viewed it as an enunciation moment, and you're doing something that really isn't, you're climbing a mountain, but it's not your true second mountain. I think there would be a lot of value in identifying that and course correcting as soon as possible. If that is you, doesn't mean you have to just all of a sudden make a leap either. You know, you can start to move in the right direction. You don't have to drastically change your life. Maybe you can't. Maybe you're like me, you're married, you got 5 kids at home. Like, you're not just going to walk away from a job and say, I'm going to be an artist, you know?
Right. Can't really do that.
Yeah, but you do want to recognize, you know, where this is all heading. And it's kind of funny because you get yourself around the right people who know you, and they can kind of see your life's trajectory, and they can help point you in the right direction. it's kind of funny that you mentioned the story about your mom. Like, hey, I'm full time at church. And, oh, I knew you were going to do that. Like, well, why didn't you tell me? You could have saved me 5-10 years,
No kidding.
Well, it's because you didn't ask and you didn't want to know. And I've been in the same position. That's not a knock on you, but
and my character hadn't been built to the point
exactly
that I was ready for that, and I hadn't been through the experiences that were necessary to enable me to do a good job in this role. So,
yep. But if you're younger and you're climbing the hyper individualism first mountain, let me tell you, you can save yourself some heartache and some time if you open yourself up to the idea that maybe other people are right more than you are.
One side note on this vocation section, he calls out Viktor Frankl.
Yep.
And Man's Search for Meaning, and tells Frankl's story. If you don't know what we're talking about, go listen to that episode. We did that book, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And he then comes back to Frankl throughout the rest of the book after this point. It just made me happy. I was like, okay, that's probably a pretty good mark on the positive side of the columns for this one.
Yep.
Bring up Frankl and talk highly of him.
I knew Viktor Frankl was going to be mentioned at some point. I just didn't know where it was.
Yeah. So part 3 is when we get into marriage and the concept of maximal marriages. How would you summarize this, Mike?
How would I summarize this? Well, I forget which episode it was. Maybe it was the last one when I was talking about relationships and how, for me, basically there were no other options because I am committed to my wife. And I felt a little bit clumsy making that argument, but I knew I knew I was resolved in my spirit, and I knew what I believed about it, but I just felt like the way that I was describing it, if you didn't understand already where I was coming from, it sounded a little bit weird. And reading this section, I was like, man, I wish I could just go delete that whole argument from the internet and do it again, because he talks about how marriage is a decades-long commitment in his words. Passion peaks among the young, but marriage is the thing that peaks in old age. And when you get married, you have no idea what changes you're going to go through or what the other person is going to go through, but you're committed to the relationship, and so you're willing to figure that out as you go. The whole idea of like the contract versus the commitment that we mentioned earlier, this is where I feel like that is really exemplified. A maximal marriage is really one that stands the test of time, and not just the fact that you don't get divorced, but you completely remove yourself from that culture of individualism, which in David Brooks's words undermines the maximal definition of marriage. So marriage is constantly dragging yourself away from the goals of self. Your heart yearns to fuse with others, he says, which can only be done through joint surrender, not joint autonomy. And he uses a quote by Mike Mason: "We must return to an attitude of total abandonment." And if I were to describe my view on my marriage, it is that phrase specifically: totally abandoning all of the other options for the rest of my life and being completely okay with that, which as we talk about hyper-individualism and the focus on the self, and I defined lust versus love earlier, and just focusing on like what's in it for me, you will never get to that point. I recognize a very different way of looking at things, but this is kind of what he says is how great marriages are measured. It's not about your victories, it's about taking joy in your spouse's victories. He mentions on page 143, people talk about settling down, but in fact, marriage is a hopeful revolution two people undertake together without any real idea of what's on the other side. Yeah. For your marriage to work, you've got to know that your spouse well enough to love her in the way that will bring out her loveliness. You can't, it's not about you. I guess if I were to summarize this whole chapter, that would be it. It's not about you.
Sure. No, I think that's a great way to look at it. my wife and I have been through a lot of ups and downs, and with my health problems of late, it of course turns up the heat and forces you to have conversations that are not fun. And we've been through a lot of that. And reading this section, it's like, one of the things I think, we need to work on is being more focused on the other's needs. Like, we do a pretty good job of that. I'm not saying that this is a huge flaw. We've talked about this quite a bit in our marriage, but maximal marriages, he does mention a number of ways that this comes to fruition. And one of those is by seeing and noticing the nuances of how that other person lives and likes to live, and being willing to help them in that process. It's definitely a long-term relationship, and it's a commitment to interdependence. And so much of what we see in a lot of the books that we've read for Bookworm is how to become better as you as an individual.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, it's how do you, when marriage is brought up, which isn't a lot, but it does come up. When it's brought up, it seems like there's this air of, taking care of your side of that marriage.
Yep.
Which I'm not saying is bad, but I also don't know that we've really caught that in the past. And I would guess that if we went back and reread a lot of those sections, that we would notice it more now.
Yeah.
Because having this view of interdependence and like, we are here to work as one isn't something that's talked about a lot, but you're making a commitment to do things together instead of individually.
And not even the interdependence where we're going to work as one, but I would say, taking it a step further, the belief that we have to figure out how to make this work because there's no going back.
Correct. You're fully 100% all on board with, we have to figure out how to work together in order to achieve a common goal. And this is partly why I'm saying I want to have a lot of this conversation with my wife, obviously on a deeper level. I love you, Mike, but, I want to have that conversation with her as well, because this is something that we're going to have to go on a journey for together. So that's something that I'm planning to initiate this afternoon, because this is something we are never done with, but you're always on that journey of achieving.
Yep, exactly. And then the thing that makes it work, David Brooks argues, is the fact that you burn the bridges or burn the boats, so to speak. He says that marriage is the sort of thing that is safer to go all in. It's dangerous to go in half-hearted. So that's the part that I know is going to be radical to a lot of people, is this idea that, like, wow, you really are all in for the rest of your life? Yes, absolutely, I am. And that's not to discount that people will get into bad relationships, and if your significant other is abusive, I would argue like you want to get out of that. But for the most part, it is a commitment, and it's up to you then to make it work. And the way that you make it work is not by thinking about yourself. He mentions later on that divorce doesn't happen when conflicts increase. It happens when positive things decrease. And if you're focused on yourself and what you are getting, it's impossible for the other person to read your mind. And they're probably just as selfish as you are, so they're not going to give you everything that you want. And when you don't get what you want, you will stew and brew and be negative. If you are focused on the other person and you're constantly asking the question, how can I bring surprise, joy, delight, show love, then you're going to create a lot of positive things. And so it's easy for me to see how people can get stuck in either a negative or a positive cycle. I want to break every negative cycle that ever happens, because it will happen. It's not all puppies and rainbows all the time. Newsflash for anybody who's not married. The other person isn't as perfect as you think they are, and you're not as perfect as you or they think you are. But just recognizing that stuff is happening and making the shift back over to the positive, that's kind of my goal. My big takeaway from this is to, as he puts it, overwhelm the negative by increasing the positive as much as I can.
So part 4, philosophy and faith. he goes deep into Christianity and his religious backgrounds in this section.
I think we can skip the majority of that because, yeah, it's basically his story. But he does talk a little bit at the beginning about something that he saw happen in American universities from like the 1950s until now, where he says that they used to believe in this humanistic idea, which is the teleological purpose to help students answer the ultimate questions in life, kind of teaching to the whole person. And over time, they drop that humanistic ideal. They embrace the research ideal, draws your focus away from the whole of our lives and requires you focus on some small aspect instead. I thought that was kind of interesting. And he's an academic, so his perspective as he recognizes this is kind of interesting to see like the journey that he went through from a Marxist to a Jew to a Christian to a Jew to, all over the place. By the end of the story, you're really not even sure where exactly he went.
Yeah, I'm still not sure where he lands. Yeah.
It's one of the longest sections in the book, and most of it is his personal journey, which is interesting, but probably not for Bookworm listeners.
No. Which, like, I enjoyed it. I'm sure you did as well. It's a fascinating journey. If I have one complaint with the book, like, that's probably going to be it. Like, that was probably a bit long, but I still found it interesting, but that's because it fits exactly what I'm fascinated by. So there you go.
Yep. Actually, it's not on the outline, but one thing that was interesting about this section, the last chapter in this section 22, Ramps and Walls, he talks about the siege mentality, which is us against them. And he talks about how this is the approach that a lot of Christians have.
It's so true.
This part really resonated with me, not because I think I embrace a siege mentality, but you can totally see it from other people. Like most people who are not Christians, they think of Christians and they think of like the Westboro Baptists, the people who are like yelling at people all the time, telling them they're going to hell, that sort of thing. And that's really very counterproductive, even if you think that is your mission is to proselytize people that way. But he talks about how these different things that people typically do can construct walls, things like bad listening, invasive care, giving help when people haven't asked for it.
Right.
Intellectual mediocrity was another one. And then there's other things that are ramps, which make it easy for people to embrace, I'll just say spirituality. I think that's kind of how he defined it in the book. It's not a specific religion, but things like rituals, unabashed faith, prayer, spiritual consciousness, language of good and evil, things like that. I thought that part was really interesting. And then there's one other idea here from this section. Trying to find it now. It also comes up in the community section, which we'll talk about next. But this whole idea of down and out, basically, where you focus first on yourself and then outward to other people. And it's not, using the tactics of building walls, but the tactics that would build ramps, showing people that you care, not invasive care. But I'm trying to think of a good example of this to kind of explain what I'm talking about. My church recently, we did a thing we called a block party. So there's an area in our town, which is not, small town, definitely don't have the extreme poverty like bigger cities do. But there's an area which is government housing, and the people who live there, it's not real great. In fact, one of the buildings just got condemned that people were living in. So we show up and we have this block party in like this big open area, and we set up human foosball. We've got like an inflatable obstacle course. We've got like 100 people from our church that are there. There's music. We give away stuff we gave away a gas card for people, a bus card, bikes, scooters, and things for kids. We cook up all this food and we just give it all away. It's completely free. And like everybody from these apartments like comes and hangs out, and obviously they're like, well, why are you doing this? Well, we just want to tell you God loves you. You're valuable. And that's different than busting down the door and saying, hey, get to church.
Yeah.
And that's where the invasive care idea comes in, as opposed to like, we're just going to show up and we're going to do this thing for you. If you want it, you can obviously stay inside and decline the free meal. There's plenty of people who do that. But, that's the kind of thing that is going to be more beneficial for everybody involved. That's kind of my my goal, as I'm reading this section, I obviously have my own belief system, the reason why you do things, and ultimately it is a second mountain goal, and that is to help other people, but not just so that you can check off the box and say, there, I did what I was supposed to do. It's genuinely caring about the people and wanting to see their situation improve, and not using, well, I know better as the ultimate trump card in order to see that come about.
Right. And I think that's what this whole section really comes down to, is that you're going to climb this second mountain. Faith is going to have a role to play in that to some degree. Even if you claim to be an atheist, you're still dedicating faith in something, even if it is just money and power. Like, that's definitely something you can put your faith in. You'll always think you need more, but, that's your choice. So I do find this as an interesting section, but I'm not sure what else to talk about with it. So
right.
That said, let's go into part 5, community. This is some of what instigated my interest in this whole intentional life community of sorts, which, side note, I am not building it on discourse, by the way.
Ooh.
I know that'll throw a wrench in things for people. But this whole section on community is building relationships, really. And so much of this book is that, in a nutshell, is building relationships and being intentional with sharing life together and finding the way of doing that helps you to truly feel like you are helping improve the world on a small scale or a large scale. Doesn't matter. It depends on you.
Yep.
But this is something that I think all of us need to do. Like, of all the sections, like, to me, the vocation section is incredibly important. If you're married, the marriage section is super important. The philosophy and faith piece, I would say, is vital. But the community piece, I think, is like the most down to earth. Absolutely everyone, no matter where you're at in this process, like, you can jump on board with this right away.
Yep. Totally agree. As I was reading through this, kind of when he was describing community, I was thinking of like physical community, like where you live.
Right.
And I know that is definitely one aspect of community, but I would argue for me it's not the primary one. And the question that I had in the back of my head, and kind of an action item associated with this, though nothing super specific with this, the question is basically, how can I build my communities? Or basically, what can we build together as a community? And when you look at something like the Bookworm Club, it's kind of cool to see what that has evolved into, but it's not something that you could have ever just done by yourself from scratch, even if you had a vision for this is what this thing could be. Part of community growth, what I got from going through this anyways, is that it kind of has to be organic. It has to evolve over time. You can kind of set it up to go the direction that you want. He talks about how the community narrative has 4 different parts: framing, which is the context, the narrative or what's going on, the identity, which is who we are, and then the behavior, which are the actions that define us. Like, you can set the defaults for those, but then if you really want to build a thriving community, you have to be willing to adapt those, I would argue, which is kind of interesting and also kind of challenging. So as I'm going through this, I'm kind of getting a different blueprint, I guess, for how I am supposed to be interacting with my different communities. It has to be, the key you mentioned a little bit earlier is the intentionality behind it. Just the fact that you've got people gathered together doesn't mean that there's a community. Connections have to be made. So the question in the back of my head is kind of, how do I facilitate that connection making?
For sure. Like, it's a difficult thing. Like, I just finished reading The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, and that's a lot of what she talks about, is how do you put together these events or these gatherings that draw people in and have people continuing to talk about them. And so much of that plays into this because exactly what she's talking about is building communities. She never says that per se, but that's what she's referring to. This is the same thing in that whenever you're putting together moments or events, whether they're in person or they're online, on something like the Bookworm Club or on the new Analog Joe thing, like no matter where those are, the whole point is to connect with other people in some form. I have all kinds of visions of how that could happen in person. I have thoughts on how you can do that online. I think both have their place. But again, if you're intentional and you make a decision about how you want that to happen, don't think about it in the way that it needs to happen super long term, like making a 10-year plan. Like I could see where you want to do that. It's where like making the plan is everything, but having a plan is nothing, like that whole concept. Like you're going to deviate from it. But that whole mentality of like, let's decide what we're going to be intentional about in this next interaction and then grow from there. Like that to me is super important.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I guess, a little bit, because in the Code of the Neighbor section, he talks about this concept of having 30-year eyes, where you do look 30 years into the picture, into the future,
right.
about the thing that you're building. But that's different. Like you're not interacting with the people around you in your community today with the specific perspective of what can I get from you in 30 years.
Correct. Yes.
That's the difference there. And then the other thing that's kind of crazy about this, especially as people who work in the productivity space and are huge tech nerds, is that relationships don't scale.
Yeah.
There's no automation to this.
No.
There's no technological way to make it more efficient. Like you just got to put in the time. But obviously the whole gist of the book is that the relationships are the main thing. People are the main thing, and that it's worth it.
I like that. Anything else you want to add to this before we wrap?
I don't think so. I mean, I put in the outline this idea of the central journey. There's really not a whole lot to say about this. I think we just kind of encapsulated this, but this is the term he uses for making that move from self to service, where it's all about me to it's all about other people. And I like that term, essential journey, so I'll probably use that going forward. If you hear me drop that term, that's what it means.
No, I like that. I like ending there. So that said, action items, Mike. What you got?
I have a couple action questions, not action items. So the first one, well, I'll mention the one that I mentioned already, which is asking myself the question, how can I build my communities in a more effective way? Not more efficient way, more effective. So deepen the relationships that I have, basically. And then the other question that I want to ask myself comes from the first section, I believe. I can't remember if it's the vocation section or if it's the very first section where he's talking about the two mountains. But he talks about the concept of mentors a little bit, and how mentors kind of inspire you to push through things. Let me see where I wrote that down. Oh, yeah, chapter 11, what mentors do. He makes the point that there's some things you can't learn in books, and mentors teach us what excellence looks like day to day. They teach you how to embrace the struggle. And I really liked that definition, and it makes me ask the question, who do I consider to be my mentors? I don't think I have a formal mentor relationship. I do have a couple people specifically who I would argue they do have to be older than you because there's value in the life experience that people have. There's a couple people in my life that I can think of specifically who kind of serve that role for me. I'm not sure if I've ever told them that they serve that role for me. So one obviously is going to be my dad. One is going to be David Sparks, my co-host over at Focused. And one of them is going to be Mike Diamond, who is a guy in my Appleton Mastermind who I've learned a lot from. But I want to ask that question and think about who are the other people that I have access to that could be mentors for me. And it doesn't have to be something where like, okay, we're going to meet once a week and I'm going to bring a notebook and you just say whatever you want. But I think the value is in recognizing the people who have the potential to be my mentors and then placing more emphasis, attention, importance on what they have to say, if that makes sense.
It does.
Okay.
It does. I think that was in the whole mentors thing is in the vocation section somewhere in there.
Oh, by the way, I'm an idiot. One other one I do have to call out because I do have like a regular relationship that I just described. You know, I do regular discipleship with my pastor. He's another person that I would definitely define as a mentor. I just am so used to it, I guess, that my brain didn't go there.
Nice. Well, I've got 2 action items here. One is, and I've mentioned this a few times, is talk with my wife. I just want to work through some of this. There may be more action items that come from that. Hopefully not on a honeydew format, but, here we go. Another one, this one was just mentioned in passing. They were referring to a certain area where there was a family and they got around a table, and then after they were done eating, they would go grab a piano and play music and sing. My wife and I have kind of wanted to do that for a long time, of just starting to get together with our girls and play piano and play a record or something and sing with it together. Like, that's something I've wanted to do for a long time. I think it's about time we started doing it. I'm going to do that tonight. We're going to start this, Mike.
Awesome. I love that one.
So it'll be a fun one. All right. Style and rating. Hit me.
All right. This is a very meaty book. It's a very good book. It's also kind of different from a lot of the stuff that we read that I really, really enjoy. Like I mentioned, I barely got this one done. I've been reading this one actually for almost 2 weeks, but it's the kind of thing where like I'll sit down to read it at night. The chapters are short. I'll read 8 pages, and then I just got to like come up for a breath and kind of think about what I just read. So felt very different than a lot of the other books that you can crank through in a day or two. And when I was considering author style and rating, I was thinking back to like how I've read this book compared to some of those other ones, like Mindset. I really just devoured Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. We mentioned a couple of those other ones, Make Time, that I just like I couldn't put it down. This was definitely not one that I couldn't put down, and it made me question like, well, does that diminish the quality of the book then? And after talking through it, I think I've decided that no, it does not. It's definitely not going to be for everybody. There is also obviously a faith-based component to this. I would say it's not. It's pretty subtle. Like he mentions it where it's appropriate, but it is definitely not beating you over the head with it. And you can definitely glean everything out of the book without subscribing to his belief system, which you really don't even, like we mentioned, we really don't even know exactly what it is because he's just kind of sharing his experiences.
And I should say that I didn't really, like, it was quite a ways into it before I fully connected that he was a Bible-believing person in some form. It took me, like, it was probably 2/3 of the way through the book before I even connected that.
Yeah, so it's definitely not a religious book. It's not a faith book. It is, the subtitle says it all, The Quest for a Moral Life. It's a character-building book. It's kind of interesting to hear him talk about the lessons he learned from the previous books that he had written. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's a really, really good writer. Sometimes it's a little bit detrimental because he's so smart that you kind of have to stop and think about what you just read to really understand it. Like if you write online, there's tools that'll help you write at like a 5th grade reading level. Like, what's that? Yoast SEO, I think, is the plugin for WordPress where it'll tell you like your readability is too high. Well, if you struggle with that, then you're not going to like David Brooks for sure. But, if you don't mind something that is, a little bit, that requires you to chew on it a little bit, then this book is phenomenal. I'm really glad that I read it, not just because he seems to like the same themes that I like. I feel like reading this, I learned a lot. I gained a lot of insight. I understood a lot of things in a different light. The light bulb went on a couple different times, like, oh, that's why I have an issue with this. It's a long book for sure. He cites a lot of other stuff from a lot of other people, which if I had one nitpick with this book, I would say that would be the thing. Somebody told me one time that I have been in this space long enough that I can synthesize these ideas and add my own spin to it and not have to give people credit every single time I mention, an idea. And that's kind of what he does. So and so says this in this book, they say that, and that got a little bit old for me, because really what I wanted to know was what David Brooks was saying. I get it. There's a lot of value in how he pieces all of this stuff together, but it would be a more interesting read, I think, if it was, just him speaking and him not trying to like download everything that he has learned in his entire life into one volume, if that makes sense. I'm going to rate it at 4.5 stars. Just because it is a little bit difficult to get through. I can totally see a scenario where somebody hears us talking about this, they go pick up the book, they start reading it, and they can't get through it.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you to push past that if you can, because there is a lot of great stuff in here. I feel like the journey that he describes is something that is inevitable for just about everyone. And so if you're able to glean a little bit of wisdom before you get there, that would definitely be a good thing. I mentioned, I feel like I've kind of gone through some of this stuff. I probably have to go through it again at some point, but also in the back of my head, I'm like, man, I wish I would have read this earlier. I probably would have responded a little bit more appropriately when I had to go through that stuff.
Sure.
And again, you can't look back and say, well, that was a mistake, or I wish that wouldn't have happened. It happened. Learn what you can from it and try to do better next time. So, but yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I'm glad that it was recommended to me. I'm glad everybody in the Bookworm Club voted for it. I'm glad I got to talk to you about it.
Well, I love this book. I'm with you in saying that I wish I had finished reading this one much earlier and would have liked to have read this twice before we recorded it. But I love it. I mean, it's a great book, and there's a lot of stories to it. I really liked that. He's an extremely well-read author, which I always tend to appreciate. To your point, this is not a third grade reading level. This is definitely higher than that. I definitely appreciate that, though. In my case, it was kind of a breath of fresh air to some degree. It's like, okay, you're not just going to spoon feed me everything. You're going to make me actually process through this. So this is not one, I had a hard time putting it down, I will say that, but it's not one that I found myself struggling to read. But maybe that's because we've read so much at this point. That could be the case. It definitely got to me a little bit when he started getting into some of Viktor Frankl's things. And in my head, I was like, oh, he mentioned Frankl, Mike's going to rate it a 5. That's what went through my head. Definitely not necessarily true, and definitely shouldn't hold up just by that.
Well, a case could be made, for sure.
Yeah, because Viktor Frankl has been brought up in other books that were not rated well. So that can be a factor there. I will join you at 4.5, mostly because I don't think it's for everybody per se, because it is a little bit more difficult to read. There are a couple sections I wish he had shortened and shouldn't have elaborated on. I think there was some of it he just wanted to tell his story, and although some of that is good, I think he overdid it, and
sure,
it took away from what he was trying to say and lengthened a section that shouldn't have been. Thus, the book ended up a little bit longer than I felt it should have been. But I really, really enjoyed this, and it has prompted me to ask some hard questions that not every book will ask, or cause me to ask. So I'll join you at 4.5. It's a great book. I definitely recommend it.
Awesome. So what are we reading next?
Up next, Getting Results the Agile Way by J.D. Meyer. This one's been on my list for a while. It's kind of a companion to GTD, way back episode 1, but has its own flair on things. So I want to drag you along with me on this one, Mike.
All right. The next book after that is not Sapiens. Sorry, Josh. Just because I feel like this book was more than I thought it was going to be. I need a little bit of a breather before we tackle that one. But the next highest voted for book on the club is Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. And this, I know nothing about this book other than what people shared in the Bookworm Club when they recommended it and the discussion that followed. Sounds fascinating, though, and I'm very intrigued by this topic.
When we were at Macstock, this was on one of the shelves there. I kind of flipped through it. I don't know if I handed it to you or not.
I should have bought it.
It looks like an interesting book. So that's nice choice. Well done, sir. For a Gap book, I have this one sitting on my shelf. Primal Branding by Patrick Hanlon. I'm picking it up like this morning is when I first picked it up. Don't really know what I'm expecting out of that, but it sounds like an interesting book.
All right. My Gap book was recommended to me by several different listeners, and that is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. This is a guy who has gone through some stuff. I don't know. I haven't started this book yet, but I do know that, from what I was told about it anyways, that he's a Marine, I believe, and when you join the Marines, you have to go through what they call Hell Week, and the goal of Hell Week is to get you to quit. The majority of people, I believe, do, or something like 40% do. He had to go through it 3 times. So this will be an interesting one about resilience, I believe, and grit, to borrow Angela Duckworth's term.
Nice. Sounds interesting.
Yeah. I don't think, this is primarily a story, I believe. I'm not sure that this there's a whole lot of necessarily like straight out advice in this, but that's okay. It's a Gap book. And if you want to join the club and recommend your own books, you can do that over at club.bookworm.fm. Lots of cool conversations happening over there. Lots of cool people hanging out there. So go join the club.
Yeah, we've really enjoyed the club. It's been kind of fun. And, I don't know how many times we've mentioned it on this show, not intentionally. It's just kind of come up quite a bit. Whether it's premium members or on the free side, it's just it's a fun place to have conversations about these books. There's even conversations going on about some of the Gap book recommendations that are coming out now. So it's kind of fun. So thanks for joining the club. If you're there, if you haven't, join us over on club.bookworm.fm. And that said, let's pick up Getting Results the Agile Way by J.D. Meyer. We'll go through it next time.